Hi, everybody. This is the National Security Decision Making Games Global Hotspots lecture, and we are going to review the things that we think are most interesting going on around the world today. And we're going to take questions today in Discord at the ACDC convention, and we'll go forward from there. So let me hit the next screen. So first of all, for those who have not encountered us before, we're a not-for-profit educational group devoted to understanding the world and how decisions are made. Our opinions are ours and not those of any employers or past, present, or future. And we have a mission to educate the public regarding decision-making processes of the past, present, and future. And we use fantasy and fictional works in addition to historical examples. We often run games and show up at most of the major conventions in the United States, such as Origins, Gen Con, and Dragon Con. And we also do seminars and panels like this one, where we talk about current events, technology, and those types of things. So if you wanted to know where you could find us, the three big conventions are the first part. And we've done things at academic and professional environments around the country over the last 30 years, because we're a bunch of kids that just started yesterday. Oh, I'm teasing, because we have been doing it for 30 years. We have a Facebook page and a YouTube page, so feel free to join us at those. And now we'll start our presentation. So we're going to cover a variety of topics today. We're going to talk about the areas that we find most interesting and think we can add value by sharing things we've learned along the way. And these are the topics we'll cover today. And we're going to start with managing the rise and decline of China. And I also want to quickly introduce my co-conspirators, or associates as you'd call it. We have Robert Mosher, who's retired from the State Department, avid gamer, and you've probably seen before, and David March, who is an author that's often been seen in strategy and tactics and a game designer. Craig Greathouse, who's a tenured professor at the University of North Georgia. Mike Tucker, one of our specialists from Canada, that last time I checked, he still can speak Russian after all these years and does a lot of stuff on Canadian military history. We have Mark McDonough, retired nuclear submarine officer, retired Navy captain. We have Doug Samuelson, who runs his own consulting group that deals with wargamings and simulations. So this is our team for the discussion tonight, or this afternoon. Anybody want to kick off talking about China?
How about any number you hear out of China is probably a lie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they're claiming that they've administered right now. I'm sorry, I'm going on COVID, but 1 billion doses of vaccines. But yeah, any numbers that they send you are probably not there. Whether it's how many tanks they have, what their defense spending is, just take it with a grain of salt the size of China.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, China is a very complex issue in a number of ways, and any one way you try to view China is going to have limitations in any other way. I want to point out that the Chinese have had a concerted effort to try to present themselves as this underling third world power, and they're our friends, but they are in the firm grip of a Chinese Communist Party. And as Mike said, you can't trust anything they say, because they will calculate anything and everything they say in order to match their national security priorities. Now, at the same time, though, there's as many people as they have and as many outlets they have, there are a bunch of people in China who are going to be taking the dissident role. They're going to be trying to be whistleblowers, and it's not impossible to get truth out of China. It's not impossible to get conflicting stories out of China at the same time. China is aspiring. Go ahead, Robert. Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to offer a counter theorem to your opening comment about China, because over the past year, I've come around to the viewpoint that what we're actually seeing in China today is the new Han Chinese Empire, cloaked within the ideology of the party, which Xi is then using to enforce and increase his degree of control over the state. And I'm thinking that you're talking about the dissidents. I think what happens is that I'm not the only one who sees Xi in Beijing that way. It's likely to see an increased activism among dissidents, either party members who see that he's betrayed the precepts of the party and Mao and all that legacy are a younger generation, perhaps, that looks at what he's doing and says, we're tired of living with this BS, when if we opened up and were a little bit more like Western countries and had a little bit more individual freedom, we'd all be better off.
Well, I think the other thing that we've learned is that with China, you have to verify and then trust. You can't do it the other way around. We know they have serious problems with their banking system. We know they have serious problems in a variety of environments where you don't find out until there's something that hits a public source first, like the issue we had several years ago where they had the one river full of dead pig bodies from a pig farm that was disposing of diseased animals, to the kinds of problems that they had in their own pharmaceutical processes a couple of years ago where they actually executed a senior manager for having lied about, the efficacy of their meds and the number that had been produced.
And don't forget the problem they had with the improper storage of combustibles.
Yes.
Another thing. Oh, go ahead. There was a great movie that came out a couple years ago about businesses working in China, and what they discovered is that they would come in, they bring in these great presentations on all the development work, but a few of the businessmen went to China to actually see what their factories were doing. And by the way, it's a crime in China to go and investigate to see how well your factories are doing. And they would show up and they'd be fine, like they were told they're like making hundreds of tons of paper every month. There was like 10 guys in there, one security guard. They put time-lapse cameras for a month beside the factory, and then they came back and they started short selling them. So that's what we mean when you can't trust these people.
Another thing that when you start talking about China, everybody talks about it as a rising power, and absolutely it is. But if you think about it, it's pushing a lot of buttons in terms of potential challengers all the way around it. You're looking at India. You're looking at basically South China Sea. You're looking at Japan, possibly Russia in the future, the US. It is surrounded by potential enemies, and it is doing a lot of pressing in a lot of different ways. The question starts to become that you've got to ask is, can they address everything at once? And they're trying to make it look like they can, but that becomes a big question that you always have to look at on the security side.
I was just thinking about that the other day, Craig, about how many neighbors China has. I mean, the United States has the luxury of having only 2 neighbors. You haven't seen a great power or an aspirant great power like China with this many neighbors since maybe, well, the Soviet Union to a degree, although it just simply went around swallowing them up, since the Prussians.
Agreed. Yeah. It's an interesting one, especially considering you have in India, which is led by ultranationalists with the BJP party, who's pushing. What are they, 1.1 billion, and China's 1.3 billion? So you're talking about some fairly serious players that are going to compete against China. And as they start to push out further, you're now getting away from the easy ones, and you're now getting into some very difficult states that you're going to have to deal with if you're China.
Oh, good. We've had our other staff member join us, Van Siegling, who's a new person down in the window. Wave nicely, Van. The other thing I'd like to point out, even though we aren't specifically talking about India today because it's not as high a priority as some of the other things, is, India is essentially turned into a one-party state as well. It doesn't have the same level of control over information. It doesn't have the same level of control over the country that the Chinese do. But that's something that also bears watching. And the fact that they essentially are both one-party states does affect the relationships that you're going to see as things move forward. It's affected the Belt and Road process that the Chinese have been trying to build. It affects their positions on refugees and positions on different political things dealing with migrants. So it's also something just to be aware of in general. It has an overarching effect.
Well, I'd also point out with the Chinese, they seem to also be pissing people off for no easy, good reason, especially over stuff like Hong Kong. I mean, when you start doing this stuff. You piss the Brits off. There's a big expat Chinese population in Canada, both from Hong Kong and from the mainland. And there's other people who are saying, well, look, you made this treaty 25, 30 years ago now? I'm losing time. And now you're starting to nibble away at it in terms of what you're doing with Hong
There's
Kong.
a footprint all over it.
Yeah.
And then you think, okay, we're all going to be great, Taiwan. We're all going to be one China someday, happy and brotherly, right? Just like the mainland and Hong Kong. And that's not going to sell in Taiwan.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Well,
I've got a slide that we'll come up to about the Taiwan situation, because there are a number of other factors there that most Westerners are not aware of that impact that whole mindset on both sides of the strait. But the next thing I think I really want to have us hit.
You got something else there that connects India and China. It's called the construction work in the Himalayas, in that China seems to be opening up roadways under the assumption that they might actually get business in India, which I doubt.
Yeah.
And what they're doing is, in cases where a road that's going to handle routine trucks might take, say, a 10-ton weight load, they have consistently been building 60, 65, 70-ton weight loads.
Another part of that is there's the supposition by many analysts that it's not so much to build trade with India, because they're sort of anticipating their roads are going to be heavier duty than the ones the Indians build on the other side. It's basically be able to militarily reinforce the Himalayas.
Well, it's interesting when you look at the weight loads of Chinese tanks.
Yeah.
Even tanks on transporters.
Yep.
Absolutely. The other thing that's going on with construction, though, is that especially in the Himalayas, and it has more impact on Laos and Vietnam and some of the other people down in the watershed, is they're building dams up in the Himalayas. And that's going to create a number of interesting points of leverage that the Chinese will have. It's just sort of like the same discussion we've heard in the news about Egypt and Sudan, because the countries downstream are very reliant on that water supply. And the Chinese are looking at what are their population numbers, what are their capabilities, and diverting that for either industrial or public consumption.
And that's before we've seen the full impact of climate change on either the glaciers in the Himalayas or the rain patterns.
Yeah.
And there may not be much water behind those dams.
Yeah.
One of the other things that to me,
I was just hoping to make one point before we get on, Merle.
Yeah, please go on.
This one point is kind of something that we kind of forget in the West. We're used to thinking of China as this giant monolith of one big happy country that's all centralized and unified. For most of the past couple thousand years, that's not been true. They've been divided with warlords and all sorts of other stuff, like, the games like the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and all that kind of stuff. That's much more what China's used to, being divided. So the people who are running the show right now are interested in keeping it unified at all costs. And if that means being poor rather than rich, that seems to be the calculation they're making. So
then they're going to get to the
power equation.
Then they're going to face the angry peasants in the streets of the capital going, Emperor, you've let us down.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, two quick observations, if I may. First of all, I think any representative or spokesman for the Chinese government would say your slide title is wrong. Why do you assume there's going to be a decline?
Because history tells us so, including the history of China.
We play the long
other
game,
thing is China's
and
got
we will prevail. Is their point of view. I'm not arguing with the slide. I'm telling you that the attitude of the Chinese government would be, why should there be a decline? We're better than that. We can manage our way out of that. Part of their way of managing their way out of that is to suppress anybody who might object. They're still all wrapped around the axle about the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism, which doesn't look like a threat to China to anyone but them. The other thing is they've got a real concern. We in the United States have not yet come to grips with our war in Vietnam. They haven't come to grips with theirs either. They went in there in 1978 and got their asses kicked.
So, Robert, you had another point you wanted to make?
Yeah.
No, I was just going along with what Doug had said, and the problem with official statements and official spokesmen is that even more often than they are expressing reality, they are expressing the reality that their government would wish existed. And
Wait a
yes,
second. Isn't
that's
that-
what the Chinese are doing. That's what Washington does. That's what Moscow does.
Good thing we never do that in the United States.
Ask me no questions, I'll tell you no lies.
One of the things that's very clear, and I think we mentioned it on like the next slide, is the Chinese approach to a lot of things now is defensive because they've made so much progress. They're afraid of what they might lose.
Yeah.
And for those folks who think very much in bureaucratic and organizational terms, at least in terms of the party and the party leadership, one of the big issues is what we would talk about, how the impact of demographics is going to hit them. They're growing faster than almost any other country in the world. Japan is one of the few that's way ahead of them. But, you know, what that does is it makes them susceptible to all kinds of other risks. I mean, right now, there is no social safety net like in America, even if you could talk that there's deficiencies, or like in Canada. So traditionally, older family members were cared for by the family. That's going to become a real health crisis, and either there's going to be a mass die-off due to lack of proper care, or there's going to be a huge expense in trying to take care of those people.
Merle, they already have that demographic crisis. We went through the one-child policy and all of the violations of it. We've seen the demographic impact on the gender imbalance. And we have now just recently seen that the government is now authorizing 3 children.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the rate of growth is finally, they feel, constrained enough that they in fact need to encourage a bit more population growth than the current arc was going to give them.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, the other impact is if you've got a country full of only sons, what are they going to do when they start having those only sons come back from the war front in body bags?
Yep.
They're not going to enjoy that.
Yeah, that is definitely going to be a major source of instability. If they get into a conflict, and a lot of people are concerned about some various flashpoints in East Asia where we or someone else might come into conflict with them, those body bags are going to have a much more disproportionate impact on public opinion than you would see in many other nations.
Well, we would hope. We can't guarantee that. We would hope.
Well, that's true, because one of the other things is an underlying theme is because there's such nervousness and concern about the risk to the regime, they have really implemented the biggest big brother process. It's almost like 1984. They have cameras, they have social scores for their version of Facebook, the things they're doing with the Great Firewall of China, they're locking people out. And there are a number of analysts that I've talked to that still are in the business, and they're saying a lot of the sites that they had as publicly available where the Chinese were talking to the Chinese are no longer accessible from outside the country without special tools. So that has an impact, and it tells you really how concerned they are about keeping their own plans private and ensuring that their personnel do not get contaminated by another means. I am kind of curious, since it just hit the news, and I think you're probably the one that's wired best on this, Robert, is what do you think about this latest report about the senior security chief supposedly defecting after the Hong Kong thing?
Well, I haven't seen anything else on that. So other than the mere report of it, I don't know. I do want to circle back. You were talking about the degree to which they're trying to control the cyberspace within China. You know, that also means that Beijing is probably training the largest pool of really, really smart users of the internet just about anywhere on the planet, as they all keep trying to work out the newest get-arounds and workarounds.
Well, you know, when you think about this, one of the things most Americans don't contemplate is both with India and China, and more so with China because they've had such success with trade and balance of payments. You know, if 1 in 100 students in America is a brilliant student, that's great. We got 240 million people. That number's pretty good. But they have 1 billion. So for every 1 brilliant student we have, and there's some underlying assumptions to the statement, they have 5. So don't think that they're going to particularly fall behind. The biggest differential between the West and the Chinese is the intellectual capital of people with skill sets that they built over generations from one part of the family to another and higher levels of average education, which is why the Chinese are really focused on stealing the technology and the ideas and the plans to do things so that they increase that intellectual capital and investment in the minds of the people that can do work, which is why there's certain industries, just as the Japanese, when they went to industrialization, they said, we want steel, we want iron, we want these different things. Now the Chinese are all about cyber. They're all about trying to upgrade their military. All of that stuff is being subsidized by stealing technology and stealing knowledge from other people in ways that we would not consider appropriate in the West, because we have patent law and intellectual property and think people should profit from their individual successes.
And the U.S. has 50 years of arguments with its allies over who actually owns which technology and what ideas.
Yep.
Yeah.
The counterpoint is that if you're spoon feeding all of your best minds, what are you allowing them to develop the creativity that you're looking for?
And that Robert, is a big issue. It's one of the issues that you see when you have Chinese students come to American universities getting graduate degrees. After they've spent time in the U.S., the question becomes, do they want to go home?
Yeah.
This is why the Chinese have invested in surveillance groups at the universities.
Right. Some of the groups that they've put up. But you're going to have issues of, just like with the Soviet Union, yeah, you can develop some people that are incredibly intelligent and can build some great things, but you're not going to develop some of that breakthrough capacity in some ways through the use of educational means if you don't let them have creativity.
My own experience with students from China going through engineering programs, you look at the technical side, their mathematical preparation, their technical engineering preparation, they're eating our lunch. They're very, very good. And they're very, very diligent over here. And they get through a master's program over here, and they can do things I can't do. But what they can't do is think creatively about, now, where would you apply this, and how would you know if it's not working?
Well, I'd also ask, has anyone thought of, and this may, is there anyone that you would say is an Edison-like figure in China? Right? They're very good at, I don't know how to say it. They're very good at the maths and all that stuff, but they've definitely sucked the creativity, or don't encourage creativity to think about how to use this technology maybe differently. Or, just, hey, what more technology can we develop internally then that we could profit off selling to the West, rather than just making stuff for the West?
I think that's a really good point, because every really big Chinese company that you see is running some variation of something that was done in the West. I don't want to call it a knockoff per se, but essentially it's using technology they got from someplace else in a way that it's used someplace else, and just doing more of it and cheaper.
I would like to build further on some of the things Doug said. My own experience in graduate school, in a solid-state physics course under a professor a couple of years out of Moscow, and with a bunch of Chinese students in the course. And he and I were talking about the amount of class participation, and he said that, yeah, he got a lot from the American students. He didn't get a lot of the Chinese students raising their hands, though obviously they understood the material. But he said his perception is that their culture was that you don't raise your hand unless you know the answer. In a graduate course, that isn't the Western perspective. If you want to advance a theory or start a discussion with the professor, that's what's encouraged. But there was a difference in the way that they were being trained. I don't want to discount them, however, as far as taking the initiative and becoming world leaders in some of these areas. Fact is, they're still in the early stages of developing world leadership and centers of excellence in some of these areas. And I think it's probably just another matter of another generation before they actually start to take leadership positions in a number of stovepipe areas. But on the trajectory they're in, they certainly think they're going to be eclipsing us over the next generation or two. And I'm not sure that that is an incorrect perception.
In some areas, I think probably India more than China. I've had much more experience with Indian students. What I found out is that if a person asks a question in class, that is an insult to the professor. If you don't know if you don't know something, what you're saying is the professor didn't teach it to you and he should have. So they're very reluctant to say, "I don't understand. Could you please explain?" I've got a feeling there's a lot of that going on in Chinese culture as well, and that's just deadly to creativity.
I did not see that from the Indian students I went to graduate school with. They were usually up front and actually in many cases on the graduate level running many of the curriculum. But
yeah,
but your perception is certainly valid.
It's a variation, almost a juxtaposition with the old Soviet system, where the Soviet engineers were noted for coming up with fantastic ideas and great plans, and there was absolutely no way that the government could get manufacturing to produce those ideas. You know, the classic example being the fighter aircraft that the Russians actually designed to be built with titanium, and no, they were made with steel.
So the other thing I'd point out very briefly, because you guys were talking about the cultural differences and how people operated in class and how they asked questions and stuff, and I'm putting this in the Discord chat for folks. There's a book called Riding Waves of Culture, which really talks about some of these differences culturally between Eastern and Western cultures. And the point that I would want to bring out is when you talk about instructors and you talk about creative thought, there's a lot more deference in all of those Eastern cultures to people of age. So, in other words, if we had a bunch of college and high school students here and we were running an event, they question us a lot, and we've seen that because we're older guys. But you would not see that with people from the Eastern cultural groups in general. So not only did the guy not teach you well enough and you're challenging his authority or you're criticizing him, it's the fact that in general, that's a cultural trend. Obviously, that doesn't apply everywhere, but it's an important part of understanding some of the differences.
Yeah.
And I'd also like to pose on a political side, since Xi is effectively president for life, what is that going to do with the next generation of political leadership in China?
Yeah, are they training anybody to step up?
Well, or if you look like you're going to step up, are you going to be stepping into a May 14th re-education farm?
Yeah, exactly.
If you know what I'm saying. And the fact that they took that term limit out at that level has a potential longer term consequence that you're going to get a bunch of yes men or people who have no real political gravitas ending up as president of China.
They're also going to have the problem in that they're going to have some stagnation as far as they won't be able to move up.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Robert points out in the chat that we've had almost a half hour on China now, and I would add to that it's almost all been on internals of China.
Right. But
we haven't really talked much about their interactions with other countries in the region who also have something to say about it all. It's not just us and them.
But finishing up on Mike's point, it's what you're going to see in terms of the Chinese leadership model is what we're seeing now with Putin and following in terms of Russia. When you take out basically everybody else that could possibly step in, you're going to create a vacuum after it.
So we need to get moving a little bit to cover all our topics, but this is a quick illustration of what I was talking about earlier with the population, because you're going to have a marked decrease because of the birth policies and so on, and that's going to have some interesting adjustments. I'm not sure I even have thought through all the ramifications of what happens when you have 200 people that now you have 100 people and all that infrastructure that you built, like high rises, older homes, and what you have to do for urban renewal even as a fundamental difference, and whether that affects individual wealth. Is it inherited or is it lost? Not sure.
There's also a huge issue there with which subpopulations grow and which shrink.
Right.
Got
a good example of that is the Uyghurs, because one of the things we are aware of is there is a cultural genocide going on, and the use of the term genocide is somewhat expanded compared to tradition, because this is one that through incarceration they are preventing the population from increasing. And they basically have men and women concentration camps as opposed to co-ed concentration camps. Families are divided, and the birth rate for Uyghurs has declined precipitously. So in essence, this whole area that we talk about that are inhabited by Uyghurs traditionally and across historical terms is a colony. And they're basically colonizing it and preventing the natives from reproducing. So, and that internationally creates complications with their other partners.
Well, and the genocide discussion has included even more extreme accusations of interfering with the Uyghur population, accusations of raping women internees by Han Chinese guards, sterilization. There's some pretty extreme charges being thrown around out there.
Yep. When my daughter came back from a semester in China at the very beginning, end of 06, beginning of 07, I said to her, okay, you were in country for 4 months. Is it us or them? What do you think? And she said if they could divide that country at the mountain range, east of that mountain range is a country of about 300 million people that looks a lot like the United States and could overtake that. But they've got 1 billion hungry mouths west of that mountain range, and they don't know what to do with them.
Mm-hmm. So the other thing I wanted to highlight, even though we talked about Taiwan, I don't think we'll spend a lot on this, is Taiwan has been its own nation or separate from China most of its history. And the question really that we're dealing with now is, should it be? And whether or not the natives combined with the people who came into the island when the mainland government collapsed, whether that makes a difference. So what was kind of interesting is this is very general numbers, and I'm not going to vouch that it's entirely accurate. But basically, when you look at the people living in Taiwan now, the largest proportion are Han Chinese, and some of those ethnically speaking Han Chinese were there before the collapse of the mainland government. But a good portion, and we're not sure how much, came across with Chiang Kai-shek when he lost the mainland. And then you have indigenous and tribal peoples that are another piece of that puzzle. So my impression is, and I won't vouch for this either, is these bottom three groups, the Hakka and the Hoglo and the mainlanders sections, are pretty much the minorities that were there before Chiang and company migrated. Right. And there's some ethnicity mushiness there. But the point is that there is some distinctiveness culturally because of the isolation and the fact that it had independence governance. I mean, it was under the Japanese for, 50, 60, 70 years? From 1895 through 41, 42 at the minimum. So that has a big impact. Right now, there are two things in particular I figure we'll probably wind up discussing. One is that their water shortage right now is having an impact on microchips, and all this tit for tat about whether or not Taiwan should be its own country and what the guidelines should be.
Merle, when you're talking spans of multiple decades, like 50, 60 years, it's useful to remember that we think in terms of biologically, we think of a generation as being 20, 30 years. So you're talking about Taiwan was under Japanese control for essentially 3 generations. So there were, when Chiang Kai-shek arrived on Taiwan, there were living residents on Taiwan who remembered Taiwan before the Japanese. And there are people living on Taiwan who remember it before Chiang Kai-shek arrived.
Right.
So we can't say that it's changed too much and that there's a wholly new raw identity. Now, I think what's more likely is that there is a new hybrid identity that draws on aspects of all of these influences.
Well, I'd also point out that for, 40, 50 years, basically the Republic of China was a one-party state under, Chiang Kai-shek and his descendants. But now it's much more truly democratic, and the I can't think of the name of the original Chiang's original party. But
Sun Yat-sen?
No, Kuomintang. I think he was asking for the party.
KKP, yeah.
KMT. But there's now a lot more political discourse, and I don't think the Taiwanese as a whole have any interest in going back to a one-party state, which they were for 40, 50 years.
The question in my mind would be, does Beijing look upon them as a political threat because they are going the democratic route, or at least they seem to be headed that way?
They seem to feel more threatened by the Tibetans of all things because they pay a lot of attention to how things play in the rest of the world.
Well, actually, the other piece of this is that with the Hong Kong protests having been so increasingly antagonistic, and the change in the basic law for Hong Kong, Taiwan is an example that they can't stop. And that has a real political impact for a one-party state that's worried about the mindset of the general population. Problem we have as Westerners is we don't have a way to measure how that really affects what's going on and whether people think that they could act out successfully against the central government in mainland.
Oh, no, we have a very good way. Remember Deep Throat's advice to Woodward during Watergate. Follow the money.
If there's another way, too, that you can read.
Such a big financial center. Follow who controls the money.
That didn't save Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're going to
the other thing, you can reframe the thinking about Taiwan and Beijing, too, as how much of a threat would you see a Chinese state succeeding while following any other political model than that inherited from Mao?
The Chinese the CCP would see that as a threat.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so the next subject we wanted to cover is cyber, and I know Craig loves this subject, so I'm going to let him lead.
So the one thing about cyber, when we start to talk about it, is what we've seen is it's a weapon, and we're talking about weaponized information that is becoming much more disruptive. We've seen it in the U.S. in the last couple months. The Colonial Pipeline, for example, if you were in the Southeast, you've seen other hacks go on, SolarWinds, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But what you're seeing is as you have people becoming more digitally linked, the ability to basically get in there and screw with them becomes much higher. So the U.S., yes, it has a lot of capabilities, but it also has a huge amount of vulnerability. As you start to add more countries going digital, you're going to create opportunities, which is why we've seen the North Koreans, the Chinese, the Russians all create very strong cyber capabilities, whether within the state or within patriotic hacking groups, essentially. Which is why you've seen criminal groups, not NGOs. So when we look at ISIS, they were active. Al-Qaeda was active. So you're talking about there's an easier capacity to use this than there is traditional military or insurgency capacity. If you're going to try and engage in a traditional civil war, that's expensive. You got to find people, you got to find the weapons, you got to find the logistics and everything else to go along with it. To really screw with people, 4 guys that know what they're doing with a good internet connection, and you can create some problems. So the other thing that's going to be there's a lot of profit to be made. There's a lot of stupid people on the internet, that will give people a lot of money. What did the U.S. government project that, like 10, 20% of the payments made during the pandemic basically got lost or were stolen? There was a report out there, it's some obscene number. And what we've also seen is basically a lot of scouting for doing things in the future. Where we see it, if you break it down in categories, there's vandalism, that's just changing people's websites. We're seeing a lot more cybercrime. The ransomware would be an example of this. Cyber espionage, and we were talking about this with China. You have a huge amount of information being stolen. You have most countries in the world engaging in some form of cyber espionage. We can talk about disruption of specific targets. You go back all the way back to looking at Estonia in 2007. If you look at more sustained cyber attacks, things like some of the attacks that have occurred in Ukraine coming out of Russia would be an example of that. And then we haven't seen it yet, but we're waiting for the massive cyber attacks. So those are just some areas. How much damage can they do? You could have very limited impact. For example, a few years ago, right after the WikiLeaks scandal, Google and Alphabet and Amazon basically cut off the ability to fund WikiLeaks. Certain hacker groups turned their attention to try and take down Amazon and Google and kept trying to overload their systems. And especially Amazon, they kept flipping on more servers so nobody could touch them. They deal with Black Friday. They had server capacity in huge excess amounts. You could have some limited disruptions. You could have moderate disruptions. What we saw with the Colonial Pipeline, where people were losing their minds in the South about lack of gas.
So if I can add on to that a little bit, Craig, the variability in how bad things can be from a cyber attack depends a lot upon what's been done ahead of time by people we don't always see. For example, there was a major internet outage in just the past couple of days that had international impacts across 3 private networks that affected the National Central Bank of Australia. It affected a number of companies in the United States. And what they traced it back to was an infrastructure problem with code where one user on a secondary network, because this stuff is done in layers. You've got the main nodes of the internet, you've got secondary providers, which may be cable companies that provide service. Essentially they had a minor code error that dropped their whole network off for hours, and they could find it and fix it. But that could have just as well been a malicious attack, in terms of its impact. Also, one of the things that you find is, even though we like to think we're very redundant in the United States, one of the people I know works for a major cable company. And he said they had a fire in New York in the sewers where all the stuff comes together in the financial district that knocked out the primary and the backups for stuff, because they had customers calling because you're our backup provider. Well, they had to say, it all goes through that same tunnel that there was a fire, so none of us can provide it this week. It's going to take however long it takes to run a new cable.
Right.
Merle, I think wanted to follow on that quickly, because that touches on one of the points I wanted to make, which is that in 2021, the biggest vulnerability for cyber remains the human user.
Agreed.
It's the human error, it's the human screw up, it's the laziness, it's the incompetence sometimes. Also, then you've got ongoing hacking, ransomware. Basically, what you're generating is a distrust of the internet and a certain level of chaos in the internet, and people are becoming used to it. Mm-hmm. Does this sound familiar within a political environment?
Yeah, it changes what people's expectations are and of what's normal.
And my model has always been that the significant portion of this population works for hire. And the Russian security services, going back even to the Soviet period, were known to keep criminals and criminal organizations on retainer. Mm-hmm. That they limited their activity normally within certain areas, and when the services called upon their special skills, they jumped and came answering. So, what do you need? And that's Robert, very much, I think, the way they relate to the internet, to the hackers. These Robert, groups are.
Yeah. If you look at, what is it, ATP 28, it's nicknamed Fancy Bear, it's essentially a criminal group that basically KGB, etc., have direct links to, and they've used it.
I spent 4 years in Moscow living next door to somebody who knew the cyber world.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I've been told that the U.S. has some arrangements like that, too.
Of course.
I would imagine any thoughtful government would have someone they could use as part-time help that had contacts. It's just like detectives have contacts with the police and contacts in the criminal world, so they get a chance to get insight into various things.
No
Remember what happened
institution.
remember what happened to North Korea after the attack on Sony?
Yep.
Right.
No institution has yet demonstrated a consistent capability for identifying and training hackers to work within a uniformed organization.
Yeah.
We're all still recruiting talent.
Yep.
Bureaucracies and talent generation are not compatible.
Yeah.
Big
And
organizations hire talent, they don't develop talent.
yeah. They all want to. They all want to develop it, and they're working like mad to develop it. But nobody's cracked that one yet.
Yeah, they have. The
Well, I think. Go ahead.
I want to hear who's cracked it, because that would be one of the first indicators that we're really in trouble.
Okay, so we're going to try to keep moving here because we've got a lot more territory.
talk to me offline later.
Okay.
So I think the biggest one, if we just bring it back, the SolarWinds attack from 2020, they didn't target the direct agencies. They targeted a contractor who supported these agencies and were able to get into servers everybody thought was highly protected. This is part of the vulnerability when you talk about cyber. You don't have to go against the hardened target. You go against the weaker target and then get in the back doors. And we're going to see more of this.
It's like people who go through your neighborhood and see who's locked the doors.
That's exactly right.
Yep.
From an IT professional type point of view, I also want to say that when you're dealing with updates and patches and so on and so forth, if your organization is well prepared, you have a process for it. And, there's a process that, this chunk of the network's going to be down because we're doing firmware updates and software updates and what have you. But in organizations where that's perhaps less well organized, either the updates don't get done or they get done at a much slower pace, so that vulnerabilities that have been identified for a while are still there. Right?
Agreed.
You just don't take care of the infrastructure that all your stuff is hanging off of.
Okay. So we're sort of at the halfway point, and this is a good point where we can sort of shift a little bit. One of the things that we've talked about internally, and that is something we look at for simulation, is what's the long-term impact of COVID? Because the short-term impacts are hopefully, cross our fingers, past. But the big difference seems to be the impact on the economy and the way we do different things. It looks like there's going to be a year, maybe 2 years before many of the places that are part of the supply chain are going to be vaccinated. So we're going to see things like what's going on in Brazil. And when we hit Brazil, I'll bring this up. They had cities that more people were dying than were being born. And when you have large unvaccinated populations, and there are lots of countries like this, both small and large, like Nepal's got like 2% of its population vaccinated. India said they're not going to have their population vaccinated for 2 years. So there's going to be a lot of bad news coming from those countries, regardless of anything else that we can do in the West.
And that bad news may well include new variants.
Yes, absolutely. Agreed. And that has disparate impact. That we talked about it in the United States, that poor people tend to not have as good nutrition, so sometimes they're more susceptible. They may not have good medical care or insurance. All of those things are writ large. Go to India. I believe that both for parts of rural China and India and other chunks of the third world, there are huge death counts that have been not reported because there's no system to do it. And news people have no incentive to be out there. I think we've had millions more dead from this than we've heard reports of.
Well, we know that the Iranians completely lied about how many dead they have. And we know the reporting numbers in India are problematic, and they have been for 40, 50 years. So I think you're right completely that there's millions more dead. We also haven't found some of the variants that have shown up yet. Their variant Delta. There's probably a couple more out there that they just haven't seen.
Well, there's no guarantee that we won't go back under lockdown because of a variant that our current vaccines don't work well against.
Exactly.
Because if you get 30% resistance out of the vaccine you've got now against variant epsilon, then you're still in trouble. And we're going to be talking about what's the risk and value of all the other changes we've made.
We're in a race between mutation and vaccination, and we're losing.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting is there are some social changes that have come out of it. You know, I really believe that we're always going to have a lot more online activity as part of our life. And one of the things that made that come home to me, you know, then I'll pass the baton, is, you know, I've been working with Connections, which is a professional wargaming series of conventions. And, you know, by going online, we now have the tools that we can do it and bring an international community and a broader community together for less money. You know, we've got people from London to Tokyo in our conferences, where previously none of those people could afford to come, even if they had an interest. So even though there's lots of value for in-person activities, and we all love both the social and physical and, you know, material, you know, you've got a facility and you've got lots of AV and you've got all this other stuff that you can use if you have a live conference. There are people you'll never get to meet unless you do online, and now we know how to do it. So it's my view that we're going to have a mix with any smart company or smart group of, there's certain things we're going to do online so we can bring more people into the tent. And there's certain things we're going to do physically because that's the way to build working groups.
This is going to have an impact on management and supervision, in that people who've been trained in the old methods want to see their workers working, and the workers don't really care about that, you know, especially if they're as productive or even more productive when home.
Right. We were talking a little earlier about China, about the numbers, and how I still like how when China decided to upgrade its COVID numbers, it was roughly 50% increase.
Well, you have
the other problem. Away with the 0.05, they would have.
Yeah, the other problem, such as in Mexico, where if you're admitted to the hospital and have COVID, then they'll count you. But if you don't make it into the hospital, they don't count it.
And other places where they, like people who were shot or in car accidents, got related as a COVID death, because if you related someone as a COVID death, you got more money. In Canada and in the U.S.
Well, the one thing that is a distortion regardless is, and the United States is just one example, all medical reporting on those kinds of summary numbers has inherent bias because of the way we collect it. And the way most hospitals collect it is they say everything that contributed to a death. So let's say, for example, you have a heart attack and then you get pneumonia when you're in the hospital. They're going to count both of those things as contributing to cause of death. And for a lot of people who had issues with COVID, they might have had a lot of other stuff. So it's just like when they say, well, we found 12 cases of people that have this reaction to a vaccine. Those are the 12 cases that are documented. Now, that's not to say vaccines aren't good. I'm very pro-vaccine, but you have to recognize that anecdotal reporting and anecdotal data collection is not evidence.
Sometimes it's all
and
you
the
have.
bigger the number, the harder is it for it to be exactly precise.
Yeah. You had a point, Doug?
Yeah, sometimes that's all you have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to start to move into our country discussion. And
can I make one more comment about COVID? COVID is not the only infectious disease we have to worry about. And if we focus on it entirely, the next one will blindside us.
Excellent point. So now we're going to move into Europe to start with. And since we do have a resident expert on staff, I'll let him kick that off too.
15 months ago, this would have been a lot easier. But with COVID, it's hard to see all the impacts now because the economic disruption that we expected to be able to actually look at, you can't separate it out from COVID anymore. But we know Brexit and the UK's leaving the EU has had a significant negative impact on the UK economy. It's going to continue to have an impact. However, I can't tell you how much because I can't separate it from COVID. Could it possibly lead to further erosion of the United Kingdom itself as a structure? We're seeing pushes in Scotland. You may have another push in Northern Ireland. There's a whole lot of issues that are on top of that. But how do you preserve Great Britain when you have certain entities within, the UK that really like the EU, especially the Scottish? They were getting a huge amount. Development funds flowing into the Welsh areas. Northern Ireland and that border is just a mess right now in terms of trying to deal with things.
So in terms of the EU, not EU dynamic, it sounds like, and I've read some of this too, but I just want to be sure that you don't think I'm misstating it. Because the EU has lots of economic programs and plans, like there's the central agricultural groups that deal with policy and subsidies. Generally speaking, rural and poor areas were getting different kinds of benefits from the EU because the central funds were paying stuff out. They were subsidizing crops and agriculture and certain things like that. But then there were other groups that were concerned about regulation. So that was the flip side of what are they doing to our sovereignty? Oh, gee, they changed the electric standard so that we're all more in common, but that has costs. And now do we have a different safety reg? Or now we can't call this cheese anything but a different name because it doesn't come from a specific place. So you have that regulatory regime and versus the economic support, just like we have with the federal government in the United States. There's a benefit for certain people. There's a detriment for different people.
Right. And, when you talk about Britain and the EU, Britain has always been basically split about the EU. They refused to initially join it, even though they were at the initial meetings for creation of the EEC in 1958. They left it. 3 years later, though, they applied for membership because they wanted the economics. They applied again in the mid-'60s, and they finally got in 71 after de Gaulle left. So they've always had this fight internally about does the economic benefit outweigh the sovereignty loss?
So we got a really good question, and I think there's probably a lot of people who are interested in this. What is your view on this one?
In terms of why it took so long to implement Brexit, part of it goes back to they did not put in an escape hatch to leaving the EU until the Lisbon Treaty of 2000. When was Lisbon? 2007. And if you look at Article 50, which is how you leave the EU, it's about 3 paragraphs long. Everything had to be negotiated out. Basically the acquis communautaire, which is the core competences and the core policies of the EU, is about 10 to 12,000 pages long. Mm-hmm. How do you separate yourself out of that? It takes a while. Now, they negotiated certain things and said we'd do a transition to ease out, because if they would have done a quick exit out, the British would have gotten killed in terms of their economy, because the common market wall comes down between them and all their primary trade partners. And that's what you got to understand. If you look at the level of British trade, I think it's about 50 to 60% of all British trade was directed into the EU area.
For example, the doomsayers at the time, especially if it got to a hard Brexit, the two things that kept coming up was the fact that there would be a shortage of bacon because they get their bacon mainly from Denmark. And the real scary one was that there may be issues with medications. Take an extra time to come through, and some things might be time sensitive and people would die.
Yeah. Just to give you an example, if they would have done a really hard, quick Brexit, at that point, London is now outside of the financial markets of the European Union.
Yep. And there's
That's
always quite a bit of financial institutions are moving.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about some hugely impactful financial elements that would have occurred. They needed to try and ease those. If you look at what a lot of companies did, they moved a lot of people to Dublin.
Yeah.
and got them out of London because they still needed to be able to work and integrate into the common market of the EU.
And that's the first mention I've heard of the other thing. We talk a lot about trade flows and monetary flows, but the Brexit has a huge impact on people flows across borders.
Right.
People can't take temporary jobs on the other side of a non-EU border without a lot of hassle.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Basically, what I'm seeing is the probability that Scotland will leave the United Kingdom because they foresee the economic benefit. I think there'll be a struggle in Northern Ireland, but I think they will not leave the Union because they're a little bit afraid of being taken over by the Republic of Ireland.
That depends on whether or not the Unionist Party can keep its act together. And right now, they're in disarray.
Right.
Right.
So there's, in terms of the Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland situation, there's a whole lot of levels that are on top of that historically, besides the economics of the EU and the British. So if we're going to do something on that, that's a 2-hour lecture. And an hour of that
technically, that's Craig's 2-hour lecture, followed by my 2-hour lecture, followed by a 2-hour reconciliation and handshake where we agree to disagree.
We don't need another Eastern
negotiated by the UN.
Over lectures. No, please, no.
Oh, I agree. You know, that's not something. When you start talking about Northern Ireland, that's just become so ugly. It's not even funny.
Yeah. So the one aspect of this that I think it would be helpful if we address is the dynamic of this EU, non-EU border for Northern Ireland and the furball it creates. And what I'd like to focus on rather than all the minutia is, from a practical standpoint, what does it screw with people on a daily basis?
Okay. In terms of the goal of keeping an open border, essentially what it means is Northern Ireland still remains under some of the EU regulations, even though Britain has left the EU. So some of the regulations about financial, industrial requirements still are in place. There are groups in Northern Ireland that dislike that. They want it, okay, we're leaving the EU, let's get out. But food is becoming a big issue because what gets inspected, what doesn't? What actually has free passage? What gets tariffed, what doesn't? Okay. I think I put in a slide. There's like $2.5 billion worth of goods a month that are getting tariffed because the British companies can't fill out the paperwork or haven't filled out the paperwork yet in order to get the tariff-free movement into the EU. So you're talking about a bureaucratic nightmare. You're talking about an economic issue. You're talking about changes of suppliers. Any domino you want to tip has already tipped.
Okay.
And we're just not seeing the full impact because of COVID, truthfully.
So is there anything we've left out that's important from this slide?
It's ugly. You know, that's the easiest way to say it.
The biggest single takeaway I look at is how much the economy is going to contract. That percentage is one to really worry about. Because when we talk about our analysis of international affairs, gee, I'm getting with stranger. The issue is, 4% growth is what you aim for as a minimum. These guys are going backwards.
But remember when you did 2019, 2020, the British economy actually contracted. Yeah. Because of Brexit. So.
Okay. Eastern Europe. Things are.
Welcome to the 1920s and 30s.
Oh, lovely.
I'm just looking forward to flapper dresses again. Can we all agree to that?
I got a flask.
Speakeasies.
We could all become tin horn dictators in Eastern Europe, is what you're telling us, because we have the skills?
None of us have the skills to be a tin horn dictator in Eastern Europe.
Okay.
Well,
We're all too nice.
Passport.
You need to be more adept than we are at knocking off your rivals. I wouldn't try it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a little more violent. I do think we could take over West Virginia, though, but that's another story.
Why?
Why?
That's the third story. That's true.
I think that was unanimous. 6 people all said why.
We're seeing all kinds of indicators change in Eastern Europe, but they're going back to the comfortable ways of either the Soviet era or the 20s, depending on the feature. The Poles have talked about packing the court. There's a whole bunch of rule of law issues. The packing of the court in Poland is the one that jumps out to me the most to undermine the independence of the judiciary. Media controls are greater in Poland and several other countries. Is there anything else you guys want to hit about that?
One thing that just came up, it looks like, and we'll have to see if it actually holds, in some of the regional and local elections that are coming up in Poland, the Law and Justice Party may lose a fair amount of support because of some of what they've been doing and their responses to certain things. So if that changes at the local level, you may see some of the backsliding in Poland stop with the Law and Justice Party. Because if usually in Europe, local elections basically foreshadow what we'll see at the national level.
Oh, yeah. And the other thing that would temper down on is the disruption between Poland and the EU, because there are certain standards dealing with the way justice is administered and some of the other things that are expected. And that has given the Poles some grief based on what was going on.
Right.
I think there's also a historical pattern in Poland, though, Merle, where the party may actually double down.
Yeah.
I have talked to some people who actually live in the country, and one of the things they pointed out, especially on the judiciary side of things, is that what the Polish Law and Justice Party is doing is what the opposition promised it would do. They're like, you're so much of this stuff that we're being angry about is stuff that the other side said they would do when they first got in power and didn't. So they're just doing what the people actually wanted them to do. A lot of that judiciary is left over still from the Soviet Union times.
So they're guys that are now applying the new rule set, but they're doing it in the old way because that's the habits that die hard. Yeah. So. Rule of law in Hungary, free press is one of the biggest ones, and education, especially foreign-supported educational institutions. I'm trying to remember, didn't even Soros have some problems with the kinds of things that were doing there? And he had a big operation.
Yeah.
Okay. This is the one that I think is most interesting because the trends are changing rapidly in France.
They always do.
Macron was a very interesting phenomenon when he came up because there were very specific corruption scandals and he was a new face. And they basically plastered over all of the differences of the parties in the middle. Because traditionally in many European countries, and France is a good example, there's far right and far left and a whole bunch of splinter groups in the middle. All of them plastered over their concerns, got out a big umbrella to cover themselves from the rain of corruption and the charges from the other groups. And then they got new faces to go for many different offices under the auspices of this umbrella. So like the old hand political bosses, just like we had in the United States, said, okay, we're going to have McKinley win. I guess we got to have Roosevelt on the ticket and he's got to be a face. Oh my gosh, we're one heartbeat away from something happening. But the thing is, Macron won in a landslide, relatively speaking, and has had consistent problems because there are many things he has old ways of thinking about and some things he has new ways of thinking about. And all of the people under this umbrella have had pieces come apart, one after the other.
I just want to give a little bit more about this. The Macron, when you look at him, what he tried to keep together was the old Gaullist, basically center-right, in terms of French politics. So you're talking about a political party structure or group of individuals that has supported a certain center-right type of approach since essentially de Gaulle comes back in 58. 59. It had really splintered right coming out of some of the previous conservatives, and Macron was able to pull elements back together. But the institutional structure underneath it had completely shattered. And you didn't have those strong party controls that you used to previously, which then leaves us now with where we are with the center right now losing ground to the far right, which is Le Pen, who has moderated to an extent from what her dad was. Because if you look at the National Front, what it used to be, Le Pen's father, that was insanely far right.
And for illustration purposes, I have a chart that talks about what her current policy stance is. Right. And we'll hit that in a second.
But yeah, if you looked at Macron in terms, or Le Pen, the elder, the father, he would have made a Russian ultranationalist look very happy.
So the thing I wanted to be sure I pointed out here is the reason France is on our list normally is it's like the 5th largest world power. Geographically, economically, and in terms of its ability to project power, it's like you've got the United States, the Russians, the Chinese, the Brits with the UK, and the French. Nobody else has a worldwide reach of any kind. So this is an important point that I want to be sure comes out from this, because they have possessions and participants all across the world.
Yeah, but you're really stretching it, Merle, when you say the British and French have worldwide reach. They had problems reaching across the Mediterranean to deal with Libya.
Yeah.
It's not like a big mailed fist. It's more like I can reach out a tether to have limited people intervene at maybe
anyone else
battalion level.
Yeah,
it's not like I can send divisions to Iraq.
One might have said the British didn't appear to have a lot of global reach before the Falklands War. Let's not discount someone's ability to do something in a rush. Let's also recognize that they're not going to try to do anything globally without U.S. support. I mean, nobody has global reach like the United States does. But the United States also has always valued having one more, 2, 3 more participants saying, yes, we approve of what the United States is doing so much that we're also sending a helicopter carrier, and we're also sending a couple battalions of Marines. And France is in a position to do that, where very few countries in the world are. Nobody really, even the Russians can't do what the United States does. The Chinese, hopefully, they think they're going to be able to in a couple more decades, but they can't either. I suspect it's probably only a matter of time before we see the Chinese conduct some limited operation across a major sea, but they're certainly developing the ability to do that. But global reach is a tough thing to do, and Merle has a very good point saying the French have an ability to do that. I don't think we want to, and it's important to recognize that the various countries are going to be anteing up in conflicts in the future, saying we approve of this, we don't approve of that, and whoever can ante up with a helicopter carrier has a substantial anti-hacking.
So the Germans have international reach also, but it's mostly diplomatic and economic. And that leads to a question we'll probably tackle later, is the whole nature of force and influence in the world moving from kinetic to diplomatic and economic.
Yes.
Okay, so the reason I got the next chart up is just to give you a sense of how things have changed over the past several months. The big thing that you should get out of this is look where Macron's and Le Pen's support levels are at the latest polls. They're both up around in the 25 to 27% range, and there's a strong concern that Le Pen will win the next election. Her party has won a lot of the local stuff that's going on now that staggers a bit. But here's the thing that I wanted people to get a better sense of. This would be another dramatic difference from the past. These are the big things that Le Pen's got on the agenda. This is a person that's all about protectionism in terms of trade. They've supported individuals that they say, this is the way I want to be, that have reservations about the Maastricht Treaty, the single EU currency, free trade in general, and the European Constitution. This is a strong nationalist bent person. They want to deal with the law that has to do with the fact the government can't give itself zero interest loans with bonds. She talks very big about all the social services and civil servants being the core of what she wants to do. She's for a new international trade organization to take over from the WTO. She believes that international organizations are responsible for food crises around the world. She believes they eventually should get rid of nuclear power, which in France is going to be a trick because well in the 70% plus range of their power comes from nuclear power plants.
Yeah.
She wants corporate tax equality so that when small businesses pay 33% or so, that the big businesses should pay that too. And she blames globalization, intergovernmental organizations, monodialism in Europe, free trade and ultraliberalism for the decline of the world economy. This is a big change. And she believes a multipolar world is the way to do. She doesn't want to be a U.S. lackey. It sounds like de Gaulle in a lot of ways. And she wants to end both illegal and legal immigration.
That's not going to work.
Yeah.
This is going to be a sea change if she wins the election.
But here's the thing. The only way to do some of this stuff is you pull yourself out of the EU, if you're France. The French economy would get crushed. Just absolutely crushed. And the French farmers specifically would get crushed because the German businesses pay for the French farmers. That's what CAP was all about, the Common Agricultural Policy. And it's still that way.
Yeah.
If she tries to implement some of this stuff, the courts are just going to smack her hard.
So basically, is it your view that if she won, about a third of this would become rhetoric, and the other 2/3 she'd be working for and maybe get one of the 1/3?
Maybe.
But what does she think she can do instead of nuclear?
That's not addressed in anything I've seen.
Right.
Maybe she has a plan, but I haven't
Mental
seen it.
powers.
Right. The other thing that we need to remember is in terms of the vote for the presidency, what we have seen in the past is what we saw the last time National Front and Le Pen got anywhere close. All the socialists and everybody on the left voted for the center-right candidate.
Yeah.
And that's another thing to realize that most Americans aren't aware of is France does 2 rounds of elections for president.
Right.
That most commonly occurs unless there's a super majority of some kind. So there's a first round and then people realign for the second round.
Right. So
Well, because they also get candidates to the curb.
yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So
But I think if you look at that, your chart where it's showing a 1 point difference between Le Pen and Macron, what'll probably happen is that it'll be Le Pen and Macron in the runoff, and that all the other 50% or so will say, "Oh crap, it can't be her. It's got to be Macron." Even though I'll hold my nose and do it because
No, I think they'll ditch Macron. They'll do what they did last time when it was the socialist Hollande. They found Macron, they made him into someone, and they'll do the same this time. They'll find another guy who's at 3% of the polls, just like Macron was. They'll stuff him up, they'll ditch him, and they'll put down another center-right happy face.
So in other words, they will
have
say
no idea who he is.
puppet.
Isn't their
the
process,
public
though,
face.
you have this free-for-all first round, and then the top 2 from there have the runoff?
Yes.
You can't just pull somebody in between
No.
rounds 1 and 2?
No, you got to have a name that you had in the play before, but it becomes like the selection of the least objectionable alternative.
Yes.
But 6 months out of the last French election, no one knew who Macron was. And by the time they got across the finish line, he was the winner. And I think that will be what will most likely happen again in France. They'll ditch Macron because he's that, and they'll find someone else to make look good, and they'll get him or her across the finish line.
Okay. So the other thing I wanted to address, and I won't say that we're quite as technical here as we'd like to be, because it's going to require some more research before we do an in-depth, is, the space race is really heating up. I mean, essentially, the Chinese just manned a orbiting space station. Their guys are up there now. The Russians have talked about they're pulling out and they're stripping equipment out of the International Space Station already in preparations for being done with that. They're talking about a partnership with the Chinese because the Russians, for some reason, can't seem to do it on their own anymore. It's not like the heydays of the Cold War. The Indians are doing a lot of small projects with single capabilities for any individual project, but they're doing what a bricklayer does. I take one layer of bricks and another layer of bricks and another layer of bricks, and before I know it, I have a house. That's their strategy right now. So you'll see that there's some other minor actors, but these are essentially the people that are launching. The
I
other
think
thing
for the
that makes
Russians,
that useful, yeah, go on.
I think for the Russians, I think it might also be a money thing, right? If I can get the Chinese to pay to launch from Kazakhstan, because they need heavier loads than they can lift, maybe I can make some more money that way.
Well, I think they decided.
I think it also might
America's
be
not gonna bankroll it.
getting insiders into their technology base, so they can see exactly what the Chinese are up to and cozying up to them. So yeah, I think they're legitimate and cynical reasons for them to participate.
Well, I think
They did the same thing with the U.S. They had more lift. We had more advanced miniaturized technology. We can help each other.
Well, the other thing that really made a difference was NASA was subsidizing the remnants of the old Russian program.
Yep.
And that kept the program alive. So I think what they've realized is that NASA's handing a lot of stuff off to places like SpaceX. You know, all these private contractors who really seem to have very good products, and their cost to launch goes way down. So the Russians are no longer competitive. It used to be they were the low price leader for getting stuff into space, because their labor costs were relatively low and their technology investment had been high enough that they had a production line for their rockets and the other stuff. So right now, they perceive the Chinese as flush with money and willing to maybe partner, where America is less and less willing to partner because we have all these other sources.
Well, we also have the political frictions between the U.S. and Russia, and that's not helping people support the transactions. You know, we keep funneling money into Russia, and people want to know why.
Absolutely. So here's the piece that I think is interesting. This is sadly about 2.5 years old, but it gives you a sense of who's in the space. No pun intended. It shows you a number of launches across the years, and it gets really harder to follow with all the new launch companies. I was looking for a better graphic, but it gives you a sense of proportionality, which is what we often try to go for, so that you have a sense of direction and can see trends. This is the last good year we've got stats on for cost to reach orbit.
Yeah.
And you can see how dramatically it's dropped. There are some reports that some of these small companies that will do suborbital and barely orbital launches, like the New Zealand company that's launching from the back of a truck, you know, that are launching microsatellites and stuff like that, may also be in the lower price range, but they're very niche markets right now. This is, I think, the one thing that's a little bit more illustrative of what's going on. Now, I'll weight this with one other counterweight piece, and that is, historically, although the percentages have got better, 1 in 20 launches fails.
Yep.
And that's pretty true across any nation's base. Now, obviously, there's some exceptions because some of them have a very small count, but the Japanese have a higher rate of loss on average than some of the others. You see, they launched 4, but they had 1 year they lost like 3 on the launch pad. You know, so, you know, if you saw this over time, there would be some other stuff, but I don't think anybody's compiled it visually in a way that we can use. But it does give you a sense of the proportionality of players. Look how many launches the Chinese are up to. We don't hear this in American news sources. It's important to understand that they have a major initiative to build a space station, build other outlets, have things hit the moon and Mars. And, you know, we talk about international law sometimes, but we could be back to the age of discovery where the first guy who puts his flag on something is going to say, stay away. And the question is going to be whether they've got the power to enforce it. Any other thoughts here, guys? Okay. Yes, this is a favorite topic, because right now we're going to see at least a temporary departure of a fixture of international politics.
I give them 6 months.
Can't tell me that you guys don't have thoughts.
Well, it depends on how many years he gets in prison for the corruption issues.
Well, obviously, one of the real questions is how fast he'll be taken to trial now that his immunity is going to be gone, and the speed of that is going to have an impact on his ability to return.
Right. I've heard the theory that that this coalition has come into power just so he can speed through the trial and come back.
So, do you think that
buying
he's
that.
got a chance at trial?
I'm not buying that. What he wanted was no trial, not a quick trial.
I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know how many cans, this investigation opened up and how ugly it's going to be. So we don't even know some of the ugliness that may or may not come out with this trial yet. In terms of the coalition that they put together, that coalition can't last long term.
Oh, absolutely.
Now
we had a defection like before it even hit, power.
Right. But we're at the point now, they had been so locked in terms of their previous elections. What was it? 4 and 2 years?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And for a 5th. This was just basically to put off having to do another national election where they basically stagnate again. But the next national election, if Bibi isn't there, it's going to be ugly, and who knows what's going to come out.
Leave it to Israel to copy Weimar.
Now that's really nasty.
That is cold.
Yeah, well, cold hard facts.
Okay.
I point out from Canadian experience where we have from time to time indulged in coalition government. Typically, it's 1.5 to 2 years. It's probably a lot less because the spread of political groups is so far left to right that maybe it'll make the end of the year.
I'm not sure it'll make that long, but we'll see. I think it's volatile enough. The real question in my mind has always been whether or not there's some personality that can take over from Bibi. Because now, mind you, this is probably incendiary, but I'm going to say it. My view is it's like Capone Chicago. Bibi's Capone. And nobody's challenged him because he's got an operation and it's loyal to him and the people are loyal to him. But if he's gone, the question is who could take the reins of the party he led? Because that really is the party that should be running the center. When you look at it, they're dead center on all the other issues when you look at the spectrum of Israeli politics. And that's the natural party to run a coalition. Right. You might not like them. They might be too far right for somebody else's predilection. But when you look at the summary of the demographics of those parties and what they stand for, the middle of it is Likud.
Yeah.
The difference from Capone, though, Merle, is that with Capone, there was a clear, obvious successor. Nitti was with Capone for a long time. He was known as the enforcer. He was the guy who took care of things that Capone didn't want to be linked to. I don't see anybody having stayed in that position with Bibi for that long. They come and they go.
Exactly.
Right. The other thing, Mike, getting back to your issue, I don't think it would be Canada's the best example. I think it's more an Italian sense. They may have to go pluck somebody out of relative obscurity.
No, I just sort of giving it, what the best before date is probably on the coalition is probably no more than 1.5 to 2 years.
Well, but I think it's more like Italy, where you could have anywhere from 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
The way the coalition is set up, the prime ministership is supposed to rotate from Naftali Bennett to the.
I don't think it's going to survive long enough for it to
in
rotate.
2 years, and I don't think anybody in Israel, including the Lapid guy, is betting that he will ever come to office that way.
Right.
Oh, absolutely.
I think the coalition will hold together just long enough to get Bibi convicted.
Yep, that's
I think that's their hope.
They won't get much done, but they'll just stay there.
Yeah.
So the next one I want to hit is Turkey, and we've moved away from talking about Turkey in a lot of our more recent lectures in the past few years.
Again, one more thing. The thing that's of interest here, I don't really care who's running Israel from the standpoint of U.S. interests or global interests, if things get hot enough that somebody thinks starting a war would improve his chances, then we have some very interesting issues. Bibi Netanyahu has done everything in his power to make a two-state solution impossible. And the majority of the coalition coming in also holds that view. Sooner or later, the question of whether you want to have one state or two states, and how could you have anything other than two states, is going to rear its ugly head beyond where everybody can ignore it. And that may not be very long. There's another party involved here called the Palestinians, and if they see an opportunity to force a division that will force things their way, they're going to take it.
And they're beginning to see Israeli Arabs show more sympathy for the Palestinians.
Yeah. Yeah. So the next step in this that I want to be sure we get.
What's going to swing this is the Jewish Israelis. Some of the younger Jewish Israelis coming up are showing a lot more sympathy for the Palestinians, and that's how revolutions happen. When the ruling class cracks, that's when you get a revolution, and that's coming.
God, that's a relief. I didn't know that anybody there showed any sympathy.
Okay, so the next subject we want to hit is Turkey, because it's a mess. They've had, their fourth banking minister in a year. And although they've had a lot of things going, the purge is still underway. They just picked up Gulen's nephew overseas and extrajudicially kidnapped him and brought him back to the country. They're very much going for the strongman role amongst regional powers. And he seems to be thinking he can play the Russians off against NATO. And I haven't figured out how that's supposed to work for him. The other thing is they were very involved, even though I've misspelled it, in Azerbaijan, supporting them against the Armenians. And that's a whole other subject for one of our lectures later this year, is what went on in the latest war and how drones and technology and international support varied. But the key thing to understand here is he aligned with Azerbaijan, and now he's talking about other issues. He's trying to build that middle way. It sounds in many ways like Le Pen. They're strongly nationalist enough that I don't want to be America's lackey. I don't want to be anybody's lackey. But he thinks he's got more leeway, I believe, than he actually does. What do you guys think?
Well, I will say one thing about Turkey is that if you want to get a second citizenship, I understand real estate in Istanbul is real cheap right now, and they have the best golden ticket passport available if you're looking to do that.
Really?
Yeah.
But you're talking about a state that has never quite been sure of where it actually sits, and he's just exacerbating it. Is it European? Is it Middle Eastern? Is it Western? Is it Arab? Is it Islamic? What is it? You can't be all things to all people before some things start to come out. You try to screw around with you've got it up there, the second channel in the Black Sea. That's going to create some geopolitical issues, and he's not in a position to play that big of game.
Yeah. That's really what I see, is he just can't play that big a game. And he's tried it, for a number of years now. Look at all the places he's deployed Turkish forces when he doesn't seem to be sure he's got the loyalty of the Turkish army. Well, maybe he does now. He's purged enough people. But I would be very uncomfortable if I was running the equivalent of a one-party state to send this many guys overseas where they're going to get other ideas.
Yeah, but there's a chance they'll get killed when they're overseas.
Well, if I can only send the ones I don't like, and I can send them to a really violent place, that would be good.
Yeah.
But they've been very involved with the drone war and Turkish-built drones in Tunisia and Libya. There's a lot more geopolitical stuff going on here, and I'm still not sure where I see the percentages. It still mystifies me, the motivation behind Erdogan's approach to foreign policy.
I assume it's actually a lot of opportunism.
It could be he's taking everything that passes by and just toggling the lever to see if it makes a difference. But that really makes you think he's a lot more inept.
some of it in this and many other countries goes back to what I think was the absolutely brilliant analysis of authoritarianism. Jack Snyder, Myths of Empire. You get a couple of competing power blocks within a country. And they're trying to pull the populace over to their side. One way to do it is to get into a foreign military action and then try to rally the populace as a patriotic thing.
Yeah, that's maybe a couple years, and then war weariness kicks in.
So Erdogan's going to invade the Falklands.
Nobody could send a detachment.
No. He's going to invade the other half of Cyprus.
It worked so well in '75.
That's
It went off really, really well.
That's Turkey's powder keg. Yeah, it worked. It didn't work so well in 1975 when Greece was a lot stronger and
Exactly.
NATO.
So to raise another subject, although we're not going to cover every world crisis, the other one I've been watching closely is Brazil. Because Brazil is really right now a basket case in a couple of ways. They've been recovering from a presidential level corruption scandal. Recovering is a very relative term. The pandemic has hit them really, really hard, especially with their president that denies vaccines or anything you should take.
No, there's no such thing as COVID, Merle. You have to remember that. According to him, there's no such thing as COVID itself. At least Mexico says it's real.
So their economy is in horrible disarray. They got really old infrastructure, and government has become a really big institution as a form of either payola or as bloat because they didn't have a reform-minded administration. You had a bunch of people who were taking money from the state petrochemical company, even at the presidential level, special investigators to prosecute the president and his staff, because they were just siphoning all that money off.
Well, the oil price dropped, and all of a sudden the big prop under their economy went away.
Yeah. And, the fact COVID hit definitely cut the bottom out of their petroleum exports and their exports of syn fuels because demand dropped precipitously. Their economy shrank 5.8% last year, which means they're trying to catch up with the UK with Brexit, and they just haven't got it together.
Wow.
But I'd also point out that Brazil has lost at least 500,000 people to COVID. And if you compare that to like the United States, which is more which 600,000 plus, it's not looking good.
No, it's very, very ugly.
And then you have, all the stuff where they send the police into the poorest neighborhoods, the favelas, and, clean things up kind of, sort of, except, 22 days later, there's still other corruption problems, locally criminal problems.
Well, I still say that we should build a Brazilian cell, but I don't know how we can teach anybody to play in less than 4 hours. The play itself is a different matter. There's so many things going on there.
When I did the game about a pandemic at Rio, I was searching to find 2 or 3 knowledgeable people to play Brazil, because I knew that my friends and I, with all the analytical expertise we could focus on it, not being Brazilian, not having been in the country, just couldn't get it. And I couldn't find people to do it. They'd look at it and go, well, I know one aspect of it, but I couldn't play the country.
It's a very complicated place.
Right.
The one interesting point, though, is the rate at which they're deforesting the country has declined significantly. So they made a lot of relative progress, but it's still becoming, it's a resource extraction area. And the forests are getting smaller.
Yep.
The other thing is, they've got a whole bunch of basic decisions that they have to deal with and how they're going to change their economy in a fundamental way. And I don't think they've got the political will to make those changes. This chaos, especially with COVID's impact being so disproportionate for them, looks like it's going to be an area you should watch for quite some time. And strange as it sounds, even though there's not any organized groups that you can identify of real size, I think Brazil is a country we might have a real violent revolution at some point.
Well,
So
I don't think it's a question of political will. I don't think anybody has the insight to tell somebody what they ought to have the political will to do, other than triple the oil price, and that's out of their control.
Yeah.
And Brazil has a problem with refugees from, from Venezuela.
Right.
Yep.
And we don't even have enough information to see if Venezuela is changing. It's still in its own mess, but we have not included in the lecture because of that. It's like there's nothing new.
Yeah.
The other thing is Arctic, and I'll give this one with the points and let folks talk to it. But what we really need to see is this.
Yes, it all belongs to Canada, Merle. It's easy.
Except for the international waterways.
So where are your 13 aircraft carriers to hold it, Mike?
We're going to build some Habakkuk's.
They'll melt.
So, we know that the climate has changed enough that there's now navigation more times of the year in the Arctic, and there's a lot of discussion about that. We have issues with the Russians planting their flag on the undersea bed at the pole to try to substantiate their ability to extend power over the space. The most interesting sub-crisis I like is the seed bank that's up above what was the frost line. So folks have a particular comments they want to bring out about where we're going in the next 5 or 10 years in the Arctic.
You want to talk about emerging biological threats, new organisms, all that stuff?
Yeah.
You know what's been under that ice for God knows how many tens of thousands of years, and what condition it's in, and how
Getting stuff out of the tundra.
How unadapted current organisms are to dealing with it.
That's the sci-fi scenario of Dragon Con. That's our sci-fi scenario of Dragon Con, which might not be so sci-fi.
It ain't. Believe me, it ain't.
Well, let alone the guys who died of Spanish influenza that they've been digging up.
Yeah.
Who now may just melt out.
Well, there are a lot of things that are cause for concern there, and I'm not sure I know all the science, but when you can dig out a microbe and bring it back to life after being frozen for that long, that's cause for concern.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, okay, we're a little dull on that subject. Let's move on. We had an election someplace, and elections matter, as we all know. And this one, sort of, let's see. It
just resolved.
A guy who signed death warrants for at least 3,000 Green Revolution protesters. A guy who could become the next Ayatollah. Come on, I know you guys shouldn't be shy. I shouldn't be the monologue. Come on.
He presents such a warm and cuddly, look. Plus, the fact that the election commission basically took half or 2/3 of his opposition candidates out, and then was it that high? And then half of them, and then half of the guys who had the good housekeeping seal of approval said, "Vote for him." I wonder if he had some of his buddies visit them and say, "Here's your choice."
On the other hand, if you're going to have a regime that crashes and burns and totally discredits the revolution, could we pick a better one?
Oh, yeah. Like the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Just wait for their economy to fall apart and get overthrown.
Well, there's so many things that are amazing about Iran to me because, all evidence seems to indicate that their secret police now are worse than the Savak. All evidence seems to indicate that they're more repressive than the Shah ever was. There's evidence to indicate mass graves due to COVID and lying to the population. Mm-hmm. We're seeing major stresses on their economy because of sanctions, in particular in subsidies for the poor. All those things make you think that they would be prompt for a new green revolution that would work. But
all of the above.
Somehow they've got a very large percentage of the population tied up in these non-governmental foundations with the Quds Force economically running a third of the country, basically, either through retirees, that's their payoff, just like we talk about in Indonesia. If you retire as a colonel, they give you 50,000 acres of clear virgin forest in Borneo. It's that same kind of concept. And it doesn't really look like it's going to fall down tomorrow.
Yeah, but
that's what they said about the Soviet Union.
Or
that was my point.
If you want a closer one, it could be about East Germany. When you look at the Stasi and the level of integration into society there, nobody thought you would have any viable revolution come out of East Germany, and it did show up.
Yeah.
And remember, the mechanism in East Germany was fascinating because it was almost more of a bureaucratic mistake. The order goes out to open the border.
When Reagan went to Berlin and did Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall in fall of '87, most knowledgeable Sovietologists kind of looked at each other and went, "Yeah, that's going to happen." Nice piece of rhetoric there.
Who's our Gorbachev there, though? That's my question.
I told my Foreign Service exam panel. I said in 1973 that the Soviet Union was doomed, but I said I can't tell you when it will fall.
Yeah.
So we do have an audience question.
OMJ. Where's the audience question?
It's on the screen.
On the screen.
It's bottom of the screen on the
Oh,
slide.
okay.
And I think the answer is yeah.
That works so well for
Wasn't
North
that
Korea.
both of them?
We've got another question when we hit Saudi Arabia too. But yeah,
I'd like to point out
we went from radical to more radical, didn't we? With this election?
Yes.
They solidified, the far-right radicals solidified.
Yep.
So if they made a deal where with the Biden administration to reopen or loosen sanctions for changing their uranium and radioactive processing, what would the impact be on the oil market? What do you guys think?
Well, I know right up front they had better not make any kind of agreement or alteration that requires any approval from the Hill.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I'd also like to point out that, even from the wilds of the Great White North, I haven't been seeing a lot of U.S. pressure discussion, at least from the U.S. side, to maybe we should look at, getting the Iranians back on course and relieve sanctions. But there doesn't seem to be any discussion about that at all.
There's not public discussion, but there's a lot going on back channel.
Yeah, Biden practices diplomacy the old-fashioned way.
The U.S. is very interested and has indicated that it is very interested in putting the JPCOA back on track. And if that means allowing the Iranians to revitalize their oil trade, as long as they stop the damn nuclear production,
Well,
we
the other aspect
but
of this
we're all for it.
is Iranian crude is not competitive in the same way it was before fracking and all these other sources became available. It is not nearly as competitive a product. And their market basically becomes China or nobody.
Well, the kicker for
It's
Iran
still very
is
sweet. With the move toward cleaner energy use, it becomes more valuable. It's
well, the
fractal.
kicker is if something happens to their oil market and sales, what else does Iran have to sell?
They're a resource extraction economy.
Yeah, they have other resources. They're not like, they don't look quite like Russia, which seems to have one major resource they can sell. And that's ridiculous because they have a whole bunch of other natural resources.
Carpets?
Oh,
Pistachios. I'll call up the economic charts for the next briefing, okay?
Okay.
Because we've got, there are some nice sites where we can see imports by type and exports by type and total dollar amounts and percentage of economy. But that's the World Economy lecture for later in the season.
Iran has some bright folks who can do engineering. You might be surprised at what they could do with the right incentives.
Well, they have large construction companies that had been very active and who are
like all the Arab states, they're a real country.
I wouldn't discount those guys at all, but I don't think they're a big external military threat for quite a while, other than where they might not use but sell nuclear weapons.
Well, the other thing that's also a big concern for me is when we talk about Saudi Arabia, because I think that's another very fragile regime because the leadership is really thin.
Yeah.
Unlike Iran, they are not a real country.
We could watch it fall apart overnight, and right now they're surviving by their ability to buy off opponents. And the question from the audience we had was this one, because even with the Yemen war being at a slightly lower level than we've seen recently.
Well, the other thing about Saudi Arabia is that's really one big family running the country. All it takes is one good family feud, and you've got a split that would absolutely cause that regime to fall.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that's just an area to watch. We don't have a lot of specialized knowledge there, but it just makes you worry.
Merle, we got a question
I'm watching here.
about MBS.
Yes. Yes. That was the next one. Any thought if he's in trouble? Internal
Maybe.
problems plus the war.
Maybe. We see what
And I
you
think
see.
the
We
answer
don't
is
know
maybe.
yet.
I don't have any insight into that other than I just think that they're susceptible, but there's got to be a trigger.
Well, we
Yeah,
know
for me,
there's
it's
a lot
always
of
been the
sibling
religious
rivalry.
beliefs.
Well, we've never seen that family fragment, and that would be a really unusual process.
I don't
Well,
I don't agree, Merle.
that family,
I do not agree.
that family,
Wait.
that
Yes,
family
Robert?
fragments behind closed doors. That family
Exactly,
fragments behind
yeah.
closed doors. We don't
About
see
20 years ago, we saw a very stable regime in Thailand become very unstable when somebody was denied permission to marry the girl he was interested in and went and shot the king and queen, who happened to be his parents. That's
The
how
other thing is, like,
it all happened.
with Saudi, you got what, 3 years ago, where a heck of a lot of the House of Saud was invited to stay in the hotels for an extended stretch at time until you changed your ways.
Mm-hmm. And
So
they,
I think there is some fragmentation inside, but they're
there
being
has
cowed.
been small-scale
Yeah,
murders.
Boys
and
passed
and
it over to the outside world, that's for
Once in
sure.
a while,
in the
somebody in that
19
family gets murdered.
50s, the Saudi royal family ousted their own king, and in the 1960s, they bypassed the successor in line.
Yeah.
So they determine who's going to be the king, but to them, it's a private family thing, and we're not going to see the fragments.
I always look, guys. I always want to. We always think there are other factors in Saudi Arabia, and whatever happens is, say, if the religious priests decide, screw it. Why do we need these House of Saud guys? Why don't we just rule this country directly? And
Yeah, it's not like they're such great Muslims.
Yeah, like the Wahhabists decide, why are we putting up with these losers when we could have our own theocracy?
Yeah, look at what Iran's doing.
Right?
Yes, the only
So
reason
I
they
think
haven't done that yet is that the House of Saud is very aware of that threat.
Yeah.
And that's why people disappear quietly every once in a while.
As long as they keep paying all their informers.
Right.
Well, we've got just a couple minutes left on the plan, so I think we'll close out with Afghanistan because, this removal of U.S. troops or U.S. direct troops on the ground is a big change. It's not totally unexpected to old hands because you don't want to have a war that lasts for 20 years. And we've discovered again and again, at least in my view, we have never successfully built another nation. We have only rebuilt nations that had something going for them in the first place. So, the real question is, what's going to be left? How is the Afghan government going to totter along as a minority within a fragmented country, or do we think they're going to lose? And
They're going to lose.
Win?
Do you think
They're
we
going to
could
lose to
persuade
the
the Russians?
Taliban.
Do you think we could persuade the Russians to go in there and straighten it out again?
No.
I'm thinking the Chinese are next. It's their turn.
Graveyard
And
of
economically
Empire.
speaking-
Have a go, Joe.
Economically speaking, I think they'd be interested. I think the Indians would be upset enough that it would be another great game between them, the Pakistanis, and the Chinese. Because I don't think the Pakistanis
one of my friends kept.
Yes,
Here's
Robert.
the wild card.
One of my friends kept touting the presence in Afghanistan of rare earth deposits.
Yep.
Yep.
That's where I was going.
They might as well be on the dark side of the moon for a while.
The biggest deposit of lithium that's been discovered on this planet is not too far from Kabul. There's $1 trillion worth of lithium at current market prices sitting in the middle of Afghanistan.
Well, that's the scandal where the president's brother is the one running the contract for that.
Now, how do you get it out?
Yeah.
There are three ways to get it out, and one of the ways to get it out is if the Chinese build a railroad through Uyghur country and over the mountains and take it out that way. It really changes the game for the Chinese.
And for the Uyghurs, now they've got something to hold Beijing hostage with.
Yep.
Now, the best way to take it out,
Uyghur.
given current conditions, would probably be a railroad down through Pakistan to Karachi. And that has
to the belt, yeah.
Any
And
other
the
comments
Pakistanis
that
would put some
you
blood in
think
the
are
game.
Any other comments you guys think are critical? Because I'm tempted to say that we've come to a natural ending.
Can we declare victory and withdraw, Merle?
I think we can. Anybody have any last thoughts? Okay, I'll take that as a no. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. I'm going to end the broadcast now and look forward to seeing us this year at DragonCon, hopefully live, which is the current plan. Gen Con virtually and physically at Origin. So we'll catch you later in the year. Bye for now.
Fun, everybody. Merle, how am I supposed to connect with you after this to test the slides again?